Hello and good morning friends, welcome to CEC live transmission. Dear friends, with our ongoing series on history of literary criticism, today we would be talking on Samuel Johnson. We would be discussing on Johnson as a critic, and for this discussion we have once again with us in our studios Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya. Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya is a professor of English and he is a formerly Vice Chancellor of Kurukshetra University. He has been appreciated both in India and abroad. He has authored numerous books and his admirers always try to get deep insight into the various topics through him. So let's welcome our guest Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya and let's discuss in detail Johnson as a critic. Before that, dear friends, if you want to ask questions from Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya, then you can call us straight in the studio. You are requested to call in the last 10 minutes of the lecture and ask questions from Professor Dahiya. For that, you need to contact us through our toll-free number. Our toll-free number is 1800-110-430. So let's welcome our guest Professor Bhim Singh Dahiya and let's carry forward the lecture. Hello sir, welcome to the
Thank you. Well, we shall discuss today Dr. Johnson as a critic. His full name is Samuel Johnson, you know, but he is better known as Dr. Johnson. And he was both a poet and a critic, but again better known as a critic. He wrote, to begin with, poetry, and his famous poem, Vanity of Human Wishes, is generally prescribed in M.A. Salamai all over the world. People read him as a poet also. But better known, as I said, as a critic, and particularly as a critic of Shakespeare. Because whatever observations he made on Shakespeare continue to be quoted and re-quoted and quoted, often quoted by every critic worth the name on Shakespeare. His poem, famous poem as I said, Vanity of Human Wishes. But then we shall be discussing Johnson as critic, not as poet, because what we are doing is history of literary criticism, and that too English criticism, not European as a whole. So in the line of critics in English history, we did last time Alexander Pope. And after Pope comes Dr. Johnson. Pope was in the early 18th century, and Johnson dominated the later half of the 18th century. His famous preface to Shakespeare was in fact his preface to the edition of Shakespeare. He brought out the complete work of Shakespeare, including all the 39 plays, 4 long poems, and 154 sonnets. He edited them all, and to his edition he wrote this preface. This was in 1765, later half of the 18th century. But his was not the only edition of Shakespeare in the 18th century. There were several more. To mention only a few, this one, for example, came in 1765 by Samuel Johnson. Earlier, Alexander Pope also edited Shakespeare, and he also wrote a preface. The Works of Shakespeare was the title in 1725. So 40 years before Johnson, in the early 18th century, Pope had done the same. Then there are others like William Warburton's edition, 1747, mid-century. And then you have Lewis Theobald's edition of Shakespeare, again 1747. So these 5 at least are very well known editions of Shakespeare in 18th century alone. Mind it, at that time printing press was not like today. Within seconds and within minutes you can bring out an edition. Those days it was a cumbersome job. Printing had just started and it was all manual, and it will take days and months and years sometimes to produce the entire work of Shakespeare and then write preface to it. So Shakespeare's edition of Johnson's edition of the plays of Shakespeare is 1765 dated, as I said, 40 years after Pope. And Johnson was known to be a sturdy and a stout mind. It was famous about him that he said what he believed, and he believed what he said. So he was an authoritative voice of his age. In fact, as Halliday has said, his preface to Shakespeare is a sort of summing up of the 18th century view of Shakespeare. So it can be taken as representative of not merely the age of Johnson, but the 18th century as a whole. So let us see what Johnson has to say about Shakespeare. To begin with, one of the statements he makes is, the great contention of criticism is to find the faults of the moderns and the beauties of the ancients. The oblique reference, the anonymous one without naming anyone, is obviously to Voltaire. Voltaire at that time was a leading critic from France who dominated Europe in literary matters, and his voice was considered the loudest. So he had just written before Johnson his criticism of Shakespeare, and as usual with the French, because they are more inclined towards learning, towards art rather than nature. They wouldn't believe in such a thing as genius. And if at all they do, like they accept in the case of Shakespeare, but they say he was untutored genius, means illiterate mind. So they attach too much importance to learning. The British would not. The British would attach more importance to somebody's natural qualities, what nature has gifted you with. And it is now widely and universally accepted that Shakespeare was the most gifted creative writer in all of the languages of the world, continues to be even today, despite the fact that he died 400 years ago, 1616. But even today, in all the several hundred world languages, so much has been written, and yet nobody competes with Shakespeare. So this is what Johnson says. He says, the vogue, particularly in France, is to find fault with the writer, because criticism is taken literally. You criticize somebody, but that is not what proper criticism is. Proper criticism is appreciation of an author, his work or her work. What are the good qualities? What are the great qualities? What are the special peculiarities of a particular writer? That is the job of a critic, to interpret the work of a creative writer so that it becomes available to the common reader. So, the critic comes in between the creative writer and the reader, the one great mind and the larger population. He interprets things for the common people. So, it is a great role, but Voltaire takes it, and most French would take it literally, that the critic's job is to criticize, to find fault with the author. And Voltaire found faults with Shakespeare. He said Shakespeare was an untutored genius. He did not have much education or learning to his credit. We know that. His village at that time, now a town, an important town of England, Stratford upon Avon. Avon is a river that flows through the town. Stratford is the name of that town, now town, earlier village. So Shakespeare was born in that village. In the 16th century, it was a village, small village of a few hundred population. So one can say that he didn't have much education to his credit, because he didn't study at Cambridge or Oxford. He didn't go to London. He stayed in his own village and later joined a theatre company who were visiting his village. He just went away with them to London, started acting first, and then later started writing plays, and rose to this height where no one else has reached so far. So that is Shakespeare, his education, his learning. But then he was gifted by nature. Voltaire is not able to appreciate that. So Johnson's essay is largely in response to Voltaire's criticism of Shakespeare. Obviously, there is an element of patriotism also here, because it is a French attacking an English writer. And you know the history. For ages, for centuries, England and France have been rivals to each other, militarily, politically, and educationally. So all along there has been this rivalry running between the two of them. So when Voltaire criticized Shakespeare, obviously it touched most Englishmen, and those who could write, they wrote in response. And the most lasting response is that of Johnson, who is still read, still appreciated, still quoted, because Johnson was the most quotable writer of his time, and of all times, in fact. He had sonorous sound, and he had great sense in sound. So sense in sound, sonorousness in sound. These are the two great qualities of Johnson. With that, Let us see what he has to say. First thing he says is, to works not raised upon principles demonstrative and scientific, but appealing wholly to observation and experience, no other test can be applied than length of duration and continuance of esteem. He is making out a distinction between arts and sciences. He says in sciences you have to go by rules, you have to go by principles, you have to go by the fundamentals laid down. But in arts, he says, no such rules can be laid down. You can't determine that whether Shakespeare is greater or Milton is greater. In sciences you may. You may speak of somebody's greater contribution, somebody's less. But here Johnson says the test of a writer's greatness is the duration of his survival. If Shakespeare has survived 400 years, that is a test by itself. He is admired, he has been admired all through these centuries and by all the people of the world. So obviously he is a great, that is the yardstick. That is the parameter to know the greatness of a writer. Then further he says, as among the works of nature no man can properly call a river deep or a mountain high without the knowledge of many mountains and many rivers. So in the production of genius, nothing can be styled excellent till it has been compared with other works of the same kind. The point Johnson is trying to make is that study of arts and literature in particular has to be comparative. It cannot be absolute. It cannot be individual. It has to be in relation to other writers. For example, Shakespeare had so many contemporaries. Ben Jonson was one of the greatest. Marlowe before him. And among poets, Sidney, Spenser. All these were contemporaries of Shakespeare. Then there were poets and dramatists before, and there have come poets and dramatists later. So if you have to arrive at proper judgment of Shakespeare's place in history of arts, history of literature, then you will have to know who came before him, who came after him, and who were his contemporaries. And by comparison, you have to allot him a slot, a place. Where does he really belong? How high in the scale he comes, scale of merit. So this is called comparative method in literary criticism. So 18th century propagated and followed the comparative method of literary criticism, which means never look at a writer in isolation, as if he alone and there have been no else. There have been so many. Not just one individual was there. There were writers before, there came writers after, and there were writers contemporary to him. So before and after and in his time, all that stock of writers, all that history of writing in drama, in poetry, in criticism, that has to be taken into consideration before you can assign a place to a writer. Further, he says, the Pythagorean scale of numbers was at once discovered to be perfect, but the poems of Hamlet we know not to transcend the common limits of human intelligence, but by remarking that nation after nation, century after century, has been able to do little more than transpose his incidents, new name in characters, and paraphrase in sentiments. He says, when we admire Hamlet as the greatest play, greatest work of art, on what basis do we do that? We do it on the basis of Hamlet's popularity through the ages. How much Hamlet has been read, how much Hamlet has been written about, how much Hamlet has been interpreted by so many and for numerous populations of the world. Now this, Johnson says, is the criterion in literature of the greatness of a work of art and the greatness of a writer. There is no other parameter, no other yardstick to determine the greatness of a writer except readers' response to him, to his work through the ages, which means historical. So 18th century attached great importance to history. So one of the names of schools, one of the schools in literary criticism is historical criticism. Like you have psychological criticism, like you have mythological criticism, so on and so forth. So historical criticism bases its reading and judgment on a writer's place in history, a work's place in history, not in isolation, not just an individual. Nothing exists individually. It exists in relation to other works and other writers. This is what Johnson is hammering upon. Historical criticism is comparative. That's why today, over a century now, there are separate schools, departments of comparative literature, because we believe that you cannot study literature in isolation. Even in the history of one language alone, there are world languages. India alone has several thousand dialects, and 28 languages are officially admitted. So in all of these languages, several thousand languages of India and the world, you find Shakespeare translated, Shakespeare rewritten, Shakespeare made available to the various populations of the world. So comparative method, historical method will insist upon comparing one author with another, one age also with another age. The 18th century does not exist in isolation. There were centuries before and there have been centuries thereafter. There was the 16th century, then 17th, then 18th, even in English literature. And in fact, it begins with the 14th, Chaucer. So when Johnson wrote about the English poets, his famous work, Lives of the English Poets, he is not writing about Pope alone or Johnson alone or Chaucer alone. He is writing about the entire set of poets, the important ones, the great ones who have come from 14th century onward up to the 18th. So these 400 years, 14th to 18th, he covers, and there he makes comparative study, not merely within the English terrain, but also in the larger context of Europe. That's why Voltaire comes in. The entire essay, as I said, by Johnson, called Preface to Shakespeare, was primarily in response to what Voltaire had said about Shakespeare. And he had said some very negative things. He had criticized Shakespeare for not being learned, for not being formal, not caring for the purity of forms. One of the very quoted statements he makes is that Shakespeare mixes forms. There are no pure comedies, no pure tragedies. In comedies there are tragic scenes, in tragedies there are comic scenes, which means he is a flawed genius. He is not learned enough to know the literary forms. Whereas Johnson, along with other English critics, would believe that genius is not a matter of learning. Otherwise, all these millions of PhDs from the universities, they would have been great writers. They have qualifications. But writers are seldom qualified formally. They don't have PhD degrees. They wouldn't care. Hemingway didn't complete his schooling. Shakespeare did just the schooling. Similarly, Kalidas or other Indian writers, Premchand and so on, they were not scholarly writers. They were not university trained, but they had God's gift. They had the genius. And it is that genius which finds expression in their writings, in their works. Great perception, great insight into human nature. It may be Premchand, it may be Shakespeare. The hundreds of characters they created are modeled upon the real people we meet in life, all sorts of people, good, bad and indifferent, the most virtuous and the most villainous, all that is there. But that is not available to everybody. It was available to Shakespeare. It was available to Premchand. God's gift. They were gifted by nature to have that insight into life, to have that insight into human nature, and then the ability to transcribe it, ability to recreate God-like quality of recreating the universe, recreating the entire variety of human nature. Thank you for the time being. We will resume. Well, Johnson, we were in the middle of what he has said about Shakespeare in his preface, and he is very quotable. Look at this statement. Nothing can please many and please long, but just representation of general nature. Famous statement. And in a brief sentence, nothing can please many and please long, but just representation of general nature. His indication is towards Shakespeare. He says a writer like Shakespeare, who has been universally popular all these 200 years, because Johnson is writing in the 18th century. Shakespeare died early 1616. So 200 plus years now. He says, how come that universally, and not merely in England, all over Europe and even beyond Europe, he has been liked by so many, which can please many and please long. So both the scale of time and the size of population, size of readers, both are indicators of one's greatness. You don't need rules here. Mind it, Johnson and most other English critics, they will not go after rules. French would, Voltaire would. He would care for rules rather than genius or greatness or popularity or standing of a writer. Then next makes another statement. Shakespeare is above all writers. This too is very often quoted. Shakespeare is above all writers, at least above all modern writers, the poet of nature, the poet that holds up to his readers a faithful mirror of manners and of life. Poet of nature. Nature not in the sense of trees or mountains, rivers, hills. No. Nature by which he means human nature. That Shakespeare is the poet of nature means Shakespeare is the poet of human nature. And there is hardly anything about human nature, good, bad and indifferent, as I said, which is left out of his writing. You read those 39 plays and 154 sonnets and 4 long poems, and you see the entire humanity. Johnson says Shakespeare in his work holds mirror up to nature. I would like to remind you Hamlet's instruction to the player. In the play Hamlet by Shakespeare, Hamlet wants a scene to be staged, scene of murder. And he wants that to be staged because he wants to catch the conscience of his uncle who has killed his father. He wants to identify the murderer before he takes revenge. So he is instructing the player, the actor. He says, don't overdo, don't shout too much, nor speak so low that you are not even audible to people. Stay even. He also uses the same image of holding mirror up to nature. Mirror only reflects. He doesn't add, he doesn't subtract. It shows nature as it is. So Johnson says Shakespeare does the same thing. And it is the quality of a great writer to act as a mirror up to nature, to depict, to portray, to translate, to show the entire human nature as it is in reality, as God has created it. You don't add colors to it. Don't try to improve it. A great statement. I repeat, Shakespeare is above all writers, at least above all modern writers, the poet of nature, the poet that holds up to his readers a faithful mirror of manners and of life. He further elaborates, his characters are not modified by the customs of particular places, unpracticed by the rest of the world, by the peculiarities of studies or professions which can operate but upon small numbers, or by the accidents of transient fashions or temporary opinions. They are the genuine progeny of common humanity, such as the world will always supply and observation will always find. Great statement again. He means to say that Shakespeare does not go after local effects. Later in the 19th century, you would recall, there came a movement in literature and literary criticism called naturalism, that you show on stage or on the page of your writing, it may be a play or a novel, all that is actually there. And writers followed it literally. In Europe, in the theaters, they started bringing the actual furniture of the house, actual, you see, table and chair and people sitting there, or transferring the kitchen on the stage. or the garden on the stage, which is very silly. You can't do that. Shakespeare would show garden just by a branch of a tree held in hand or fixed in the background. It has to be symbolic. Stage is after all a small one, 10 by 8 feet or 10 by 6. Now how much can you bring actually there? So representations in literature are to be symbolic. So what Johnson is trying to say is that Shakespeare went after the essential. He went after the universal. He did not go after the local. Because local is such a vast universe. Which part of the universe will you represent? There are people and people. There are scenes and scenes, mountains, hills, rivers, trees, so on and so forth. All sorts of terrains, all sorts of customs, communities, cultures. Oh, now what would you do? If you stick to just one of them, you will end up by representing from what you call nature or human nature just an iota of reality, not the entire reality. But Shakespeare represents in his work the entire reality of nature, of human nature, of everything available on earth. The greatest praise one can give to a writer, and Johnson does that. He gives this highest praise to Shakespeare. His persons act and speak by the influence of those general passions and principles by which all minds are agitated, and the whole system of life has continued in motion. In the writings of other poets, a character is too often an individual. In those of Shakespeare, it is commonly a species, which means characters in Shakespeare are types, they are not individuals. Types of humanity that we find, types of human nature that we see in this various universe. Universe is various, populations are various, human qualities are various. That is why you see in Sydney, if you remember, in the very beginning, when he is invoking goddess, the muse of poetry, "O goddess, give me the strength to write what I want to write, to describe life that is before me." And the reply comes from the goddess, "You fool, you are invoking something invisible, something which is not visible to you. Look within and write." That is the advice she gives. Look within and write, which means the entire reality, truth of the universe is within you. That is why we have had thousands of years of this Indian tradition of meditation. What is meditation? Except looking within. Don't see the spectacle outside. You see within yourself. The entire reality, the whole truth is there within yourself. So if you can concentrate, if you can detach yourself from your surroundings and can wholly focus on your own self, you will see within that self the entire universe, the entire reality. Great statement by Johnson. No wonder Johnson is so often quoted and so often read all over, as I said, in the world. Further he says, it was said of Euripides that every verse was a precept, and it may be said of Shakespeare that from his works may be collected a system of civil and economical prudence. He is referring to a Greek dramatist of ancient times, 3rd century BC. He says it was said of Euripides that in his plays there is so much wisdom about life, about world, about human nature, that you can collect those statements as proverbs, as sayings, and that will make a dictionary of sayings about human nature. So similarly, Johnson says, what was said about Euripides can as well, in fact, better be said about Shakespeare. That all the wisdom of the world is there within the writings of Shakespeare. All those 39 plays contain within themselves the wisdom of the universe. Yet his real power is not shown in the splendor of particular passages, but by the progress of his fable and the tenor of his dialogue. He says, of course, you can collect wise statements, wisdom capsules from his work. But at the same time, it cannot be said that the entire wisdom that is there in Shakespeare lies within those capsules. You have to read the complete play and the entire work. If you are reading Hamlet or King Lear or As You Like It or Twelfth Night, whichever of his plays, you have to read it from the beginning to the end. Not just a few lines or one line or two lines. The complete sense of the story will come through the length and breadth of the fable, which is enacted, which is unfolded through so many characters, their actions, their speeches, their dialogues. It is that whole, all these pieces put together, which will give you complete idea about a work. So the wisdom is not in a statement. Shakespeare's greatness is not in a single sentence or a set of sentences. It lies within the complete work. First, the complete play, individual play, and then the complete work of all the plays put together and all the writing that he did put together. He says Shakespeare always makes nature predominate over accident. Yeah. He says what an individual is a matter of accident. Accident of place and time. Accident of culture and community, accident of individual circumstances and capabilities. Now all these factors will go into the making of a person or a particular moment in someone's life. But you can't take part as a whole. Whole is whole, part is part. So it is by putting all the parts together that the whole will come. So if you want to have an idea, complete and authentic idea about the work of any writer, say Shakespeare, then you have to read him in complete, because Shakespeare is not expressed in a single sentence or a set of sentences, not even in a single play, but all the 39 plays put together, all the 154 sonnets put together, and all the long poems put together. So to know what Shakespeare is, you will have to know all this. So don't run away with a statement, he had said this. Yes, he had said this, but he had also said 1,001 other things also. So you will have to take into account all those, not just one or two. And then further, these are the petty cavils of petty minds. A poet overlooks the casual distinction of country and condition, as a painter satisfied with the figure neglects the drapery. So he says whatever is topical, whatever is local, whatever is spatial, whatever is timely, a true poet will ignore. He will go after the universal. He will go after the essential. What is the content in this particular reality which was there before and which will be there after also? Because universality is not time bound. Universality is not space bound. Both time and space, they are endless. Timelessness, spacelessness, both are the realities of life. So a great writer does not belong to a moment, does not stay within a moment, and does not confine himself to one particular place or one particular culture. These days there has been a fad about cultural studies. And what do they mean by culture? What kind of shirt an Indian wears? What kind of pantaloon an Englishman wears? Is that culture? Culture is what Matthew Arnold had defined. Culture is not a matter of individual habits. Culture does not belong to a particular community or a class or a village or a town or a country. Culture is above all these. Culture cuts across all these. Matthew Arnold in the 19th century, in his great book, which I always quote, the book is titled Culture and Anarchy, by which he means if you do not have culture in your country, in your place, you will have anarchy, you will have chaos, cannot have order, cannot have peace. cannot have stability. And he defines culture in two categories, in two qualities. One is, it is the quality of the mind. Disinterested mind. Mind which is not selfish. Mind which is not conditioned by the particulars of time and place or community. Not the superficial sense of culture. Mind which is universal. Mind which is disinterested, which rises above the individual, time as well as space. That mind which is not selfish, which is universal, which thinks of all, not one, not self, but selflessness. So disinterestedness. Second quality that he attributes to culture is decency. If you are a decent human being, if you treat other people nicely, kindly, if you treat them like a gentleman, then you are cultured. If you are boorish, if you are haughty, if you are indecent, then you are not cultured. So, decency and disinterestedness, these are the qualities. And Johnson is saying the same thing. That Shakespeare had those qualities, those universal qualities of mind and heart. A certain disinterestedness of the mind which looks beyond self, which rises above the particular, above the specific, and the quality of heart which treats everybody gently, softly, and not crudely. Your crudeness is a sign of lack of culture. So, with these words, I would say that Johnson is one of the greatest critics we have ever had, not merely in English, but perhaps in all the languages. And obviously, we cannot do justice to him just in one lecture. I was looking at the pages, we have not even gone through half of his essay. So we will have to take at least another day to do justice to what Johnson has to say about Shakespeare. Although the essay is not very long, but what he says in every word, in every sentence, is worth pondering. And as I said in the very beginning, Johnson was a ponderous mind, a prolific mind, and obviously every statement has to be taken seriously and has to be looked into, has to be analyzed, and has to be digested. Thank you for the time being.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us a productive session. And dear friends, as Professor Bhim Singh Dhaya himself said, that we need a day to discuss on Samuel Johnson's essays. So, dear friends, we would be meeting again tomorrow also and would be continuing further. So, till then, take care, goodbye. And yes, keep watching us, keep writing us at info.cc@nic.in. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.
Thank you.